This is the Enjoyer Podcast. I'm your host, James Dixon. I was saddened to see the Gaza protests at the college I attended, the University of Michigan. Not because I care about Israel or Gaza or the war going on there. I don't. Couldn't care less. But the students protesting don't care either. And that's what saddens me. The United Negro College Fund's slogan is, "A mind is a terrible thing to go to waste." When I look at the protests in Ann Arbor, at Columbia University in New York, or up at Yale, I don't see a generation of earnest young people. I don't see a generation of people whose truth journey led them to set up tent cities using identical tents. I'm not, and you are not, so naive as to think protests this organized are also spontaneous. But spontaneity and the heartfelt nature of a protest is what gives it its only claim to moral legitimacy. When people are moved by great events to do great things, we get that. In our bones, we get that. In our hearts, we felt that. Maybe not for this cause, but it's like love. When you feel it, you just know. This isn't that. And college protests have not been that for quite some time. In the 60s and 70s, the college protest became a newsworthy event. Whether people were protesting for civil rights or against the Vietnam War, they were passionate. And that passion, in most cases, was driven by self-interest. It's a comforting thought, one repeated often, that the ancestors died so that we can live. In reality, they were doing for themselves what we should be doing for ourselves, which is fighting for a better deal in the here and now. Yes, those things have downwind consequences, but ultimately the ancestors were saying, I want to be treated better today. So when you look at an American citizen demanding full citizenship, saying, I am a man, of course that's real, and of course that feels real. When you look at a college student with all of their life ahead of them, not wanting to take a detour through Indochina, of course that's real, and of course it feels real. But things changed in the 1980s. Life is a copycat league. As a people, we are monkey see, monkey do. And so if the greatest generation were the ones who fought World War II and Korea back to back, their college equivalent were the civil rights and Vietnam protesters. And they cast a shadow over their modern counterparts. And so by the time it was the 80s, rather than let the good times roll, rather than enjoy the party and the low tax rates, they did what they saw their country do for decades. They went about in search of global problems to solve, and they landed on apartheid in South Africa. For a generation that grew up integrated, this was the closest thing they could find to a modern civil rights movement. Perhaps this generation was so integrated that there wasn't even a word for it or a stigma on it. It was just life as they knew it. They didn't learn until many years later that their neighbors were black or white or Jewish or Chinese. They were always just kids. I was born in 1984, but I was a child of the 90s. Growing up in Inkster, we had a good mix of black and white, especially back then. It was all I knew. But my parents remembered the before times, or remembered hearing about them anyway. They made my sister and me watch Eyes on the Prize. This was a several-part documentary on the civil rights struggle. If you haven't seen it, I recommend you do see it. If you need a reminder of how far we've come, and that we didn't just wake up one day and all decide to sing Kumbaya and get along, that those victories were hard-earned and hard-won by actual people, and that this happened not long ago, and a lot of those people are still alive. If you don't already know that, Eyes on the Prize is where you can go learn something like that. Highly recommend it. But just a few decades earlier, from the 90s, classrooms that looked like mine in the early 90s were a source of bitter, ugly controversy. In the 1970s, the Ku Klux Klan actually blew up buses in Pontiac in protest of a forced integrated busing system. In Inkster in the 90s, no one had to force us to do anything. The school and the school system, the city was too small. There was no forced integration. We were just the people who lived in a place, and we all went to the school near us. And so when I saw the parents of those kids decades ago, when I saw the snarl in their face, when I saw some of the things they would say and some of the things they would put on signs, it was tough for me as a little kid to imagine one of my classmates' parents raising such a stink. I couldn't see them behaving in such a way, people who welcomed me into their homes. And so My parents had us watch that documentary series because we needed to know that where we were in history at that moment was an accomplishment. It was not the default, it was not always that way. It got there because of a lot of hard work and sacrifice. So, America, by the time I grew up, had come so far on race and civil rights in so short a time. With no battles left on the home front, progressives turned their sights on South African apartheid. And so suddenly a generation of college students had a reason to protest. They could demand that their college divest or pull its investments from the apartheid government. And the theory behind divestment, which actually turned out to be true when America applied it in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, is that economic collapse would ultimately collapse the regime you don't like. And so think about it. This was the 80s. Ronald Reagan was president. He wasn't woke. He was not a friend of the movement. Might not be as conservative as some people would like, but he certainly was conservative, and he certainly was unsympathetic to what was by then decades of college student protests. And by then they'd lost their legitimacy. With a president in the White House who was unlikely to listen, progressives chose a friendly target, the colleges. And they turned the idea of in loco parentis, or the idea that the college acts in the place of the parents in the formative years of a student's life, it turned that concept on its head. If the college acts in place of the parents, surely they won't overreact when the kids throw a tantrum. And so when the kids say take over an administration building or even bomb one, mom and dad won't call the cops. They'll hear the kids out and they'll throw them a bone. And so for decades, that cycle has been repeating. Apartheid is when things turn south. It's not that anti-Vietnam protests or even civil rights protests were perfect. There were anti-American messages in there if you chose to listen. And in the case of Vietnam, you didn't have to listen hard. I think the civil rights movement, if anything, is remarkable for how much they do believe in the American story, and they do believe America is capable of behaving better than it had up to that point. But the reason that the anti-America message resonated in the Vietnam War is because the people in the crowd were about to be sent off to war. For the first time in history, the cannon fodder talked back. They weren't having it. They were not going to throw their bodies on the pyre for good old Uncle Sam, if that is his real name. And who said Sam was so good anyway? What kind of good country, what kind of good people seek out a place like Vietnam, which we have no natural interest in, and say, let's go fight a war over there? Who would do such a thing? Decades later, it's all but an accepted truth that the American regime is evil. Conservatives believe it. Liberals believe it. We won't be flagged or deplatformed or get as much as a mean tweet for saying so. And the fact that so many people say so is what happens when a government loses its moral legitimacy. That's what Vietnam was. And that's what made those protests so potent. And that's what made the generations of students to follow feel like we need to match what we've just seen. So I get it. Protesting for a better arrangement for yourself. Protesting for you to be treated like an American citizen. We get that. Protesting to not be sent over to fight in a war. We get that. But chanting death to America? Like people are doing in Ann Arbor right now? Well, that's a different matter entirely. This reflects a belief that's been brewing for generations at some of these very same protests. It's a belief that America is not a special place, that America is not even good at a basic level. President Obama's mentor, Jeremiah Wright, the Reverend, he said, "God damn America." Now we have kids attending a $60,000 a year school chanting death to America. Back during the 2008 Democrat primary, Obama had to distance himself from Wright publicly. With Democrats running things the bulk of the time since, Wright's message has actually become the consensus among young people. How did we get here? In 2012, remember, we had Occupy Wall Street protests across America. So if you were to roll back the calendar 12 years, we were talking about the same dynamic, college campuses, cities across the country. We have angry young people making demands. So imagine if you've had a kid in college or kids, several kids now in college over the last 10, 15 years. Some of them you've seen be Occupy Wall Street protesters. In 2014, we had the Black Lives Matter protests. We were literally sold the fiction that being a black man and getting pulled over in America by the cops amounted to a death sentence. We were sold this fiction despite the prisons full of people where that literally could not be true if everyone was getting killed in traffic stops. The argument never made sense, but that didn't stop our colleges and universities and the Washington Post, which won a Pulitzer, compiling all these stories of unarmed black men shot by police. They created such a national hysteria that the Washington Post actually won a Pulitzer. None of it was true. Hands Up, Don't Shoot wasn't true. There was no nationwide epidemic of unarmed men, black or otherwise, being killed by police. None of it was true, but sure was a good story. So Trump wins. In 2017, we then have the Pussy Hat protests. And so for several months, we got to hear white women market themselves to some type of minority group. They didn't wear victimhood well. It looked rather silly on them, actually. So you're telling me Eric Garner can't sell loose cigarettes without getting himself killed by the tax man, but Hillary Clinton is the real victim here? There's a reason you haven't seen a pussy hat in many years. People are pretty much embarrassed for ever having worn them. Ahead of the 2020 election, we had the Black Lives Matter protests round 2. This time in honor of St. George Floyd. So this came in May 2020. We were bored and locked down, and somehow in our mass hysteria and our mass boredom, perhaps and out of just a wish to get out of the house, we decided that a man being killed during an arrest with police somehow qualified him for sainthood. Cities built statues to a man who never accomplished anything outside of the way he died. Cities burned in fear of what would happen if they didn't build statues to George Floyd. Protesters marched streets. They walked into neighborhoods. They demanded that random people at cafes raise the fist. Not so much in solidarity with the cause, more out of fear, more out of fealty, out of the fact that we have a lot of people showing up in front of your house, and if you don't do it, who knows what might happen next. The undercurrent of fear and physicality was never far from the dynamic. And so they created a world where nobody wanted to be the first comrade to stop cackling. In my old neighborhood in Ferndale, a few people even took out insurance policies. These came in the form of Black Lives Matter signs. And so when the evil spirits of the age marched down their street, they wanted to be able to signal, I'm one of the good ones. Some of the Korean store owners during the 1992 LA riots had the same idea. They kind of botched the execution on it. What they did is they would write on their storefront, me too. Basically trying to say, I'm also black, don't torch my store, don't loot my store. This was probably a few years before rap turned that into a word that black people called themselves at a mass level, so it's pretty easily seen through, but it's the same dynamic. I'm one of the good ones. Don't touch me. It's safe. So the 2020 revolution, though, it brought a level of violence that people are not likely to accept again. It's understood that when the cops let your city burn, it's the politicians who gave those orders who are to blame. And so I think we all stand ready to replace any politicians who would tell our police to stand down, who would tell our police to stand idly by, even as your livelihood burns down. And so who was given the mission in 2024? In 2024, the revolutionaries are college students. And I think this is a sign of the times that rather than try to change society or take the battle down to City Hall, college students are retreating back to their safe space. They're back to stamping their feet and yelling and demanding that mom and dad, the university, throw them a bone. Somewhere since the real protests, sometime since the 60s and 70s, each generation sought to make its mark and hold power to account. They usually did this by seeking concessions from mom and dad. And once the concession is granted, an otherwise unremarkable generation joins the pantheon of history. They can tell their kids someday that they made a difference. Though I'd love to know what they would say if the kid were to ask even a single follow-up question. Okay, what'd you do? What was the difference that resulted? And how come similar protests are going on right now as we speak if you did do so much? Tough question. But college students are no longer protesting things that involve them. And that's what I find so shocking about this era. They're no longer protesting stuff that affects them personally, like civil rights, like Vietnam. Even apartheid, I can say, okay, you're not subject to it. At least a university can control what it does invest in, You're arguably taking on a cause that the university has some form of control over. Got it. These kids, though, they're protesting for the sake of protesting. They're sitting in neatly organized tent cities and they're reciting the latest talking points. They don't go to class. They relieve their comrade in Tent 4B and they shout slogans for the cause. These kids don't give a shit about Gaza or Israel, and we don't need to pretend they do. Do not look at what's happening in Ann Arbor and think that these are, kids acting on genuine, heartfelt feelings. That's not this. I wish they cared about anything at all in their lives enough to do this kind of thing for. They don't. This is an expression of nihilism, not great belief. These are kids with nothing better to do. These are kids with nothing going on in their life that puts a fire in their belly. And so they're made to pretend that a cause a world away has somehow gotten them out of bed and into this tent city. None of it's true. None of it's real. It's all fake. It's all gay. Tear down the tent cities. I have some advice out there for the protesters in Ann Arbor and New York and elsewhere. Leave those musty ass tents immediately, right now. Run, don't walk. You have a new cause, and that new cause is to make college fun again. If you attend the University of Michigan, you're surrounded by thousands of young and single people. You literally don't know how good you have it. You'll look back many years later and you'll venerate the time and say, man, I knew future engineers, I knew future doctors, lawyers, athletes. Unless you move to the very biggest of cities and travel in the most cosmopolitan of circles, chances are you're not going to have a friend group that talented and that varied again. Lawyers hang out with lawyers, writers hang out with writers, journalists hang out with journalists. Like hangs out with like. College is the one time of life where you're not defined by where you grew up and kind of the circles that community travels you in. You get to pick your people for yourself. And you're not in a place where you're in a career field and spending most of your time with other people like yourself. You're kind of unmolded clay. And so you're trying on different personalities. You're trying out different friend groups, trying out different looks. It's all young, it's all healthy. That exploration, Godspeed. I'm not going to lie, I envy you a little bit. So in college, you guys are all just kids. You're all just running around. You're all just learning. You don't know how good you have it. But I wonder how much learning is being done if you're one of those Gaza protesters. Are you going to class? Are you doing the 2 hours of study necessary for every hour of class? Are you building relationships with your classmates? Are you building relationships with professors? Are you getting something out of your college experience other than a bad grade because you spent all your time in the tent? What's your social life like? When's the last time you've been on a date? And I'm not talking about one of these I'll see you at the protest kind of dates. I'm not talking about a sign making party. I'm talking about where you say, let's grab a drink, and she says, what time? And you say where and when, and she says, it's a date. Like Meg Ryan 90s movie style. If she doesn't say it's a date like that, with that little lilt in her voice, it's not a date. It don't count. When's the last time? Are you really leaving a beautiful woman at home to protest some war in the Middle East, which I should point out is always at war? Is that your life? Really? What are you doing? Who talked you into trading last night's reading for today's talking points? Who talked you into trading your future for a bit part in the cause? Remember being a kid? Remember having dreams? Remember when you thought in your mind's eye what college would be like? I'm thinking the vision involved chicks and beer, right? Or dudes, or whatever. But did you imagine this for yourself? Turning activism into your personality? Do you remember when you used to think for yourself? How'd you become this person? Who reduced you to simply repeating slogans that others made? If you or anyone you know is wasting your life this way, watch this video. Send this to them. It's on all of us. It's on you and me to make college fun again. To the parents of America, I have bad news. Your kid is being groomed. Not in the way you think or in the way you heard. Your children, image bearers of God, have been turned into foot soldiers in the color revolution. The aims of the revolution are clear: destabilize America by attacking its moral legitimacy. Only in an incredibly free country can people wish death to that country and not find themselves imprisoned. They even find themselves celebrated for it. Unfortunately, we now have college students unable to wrestle with such ironies. They don't see the contradictions between A and B because they don't believe A or B. It's their very soullessness. It's their very lack of mission. It's their very lack of life purpose that makes them susceptible to the groomers. For the most part, this grooming is not sexual. Sure, there's a small sliver of educators out there where pride flags in the classroom lead down a sexual road with a student. I would submit that we hear about the vast majority of those on the evening news. This form of grooming is actually arguably worse because it comes for your child's future. Okay, so instead of teaching your kid reading, writing, or math, your kid is asked how they feel. Instead of being taught how to think, your kid's being told what to say and what to think. Pronouns are not being taught as an English part of speech, but in the context of identity, which is inviolate, which means there's some questions that are rude to ask and we should just avoid them. And the only safe thing you could ever do is repeat what you were told today. That is the exact opposite of an education. But do you talk to your kid enough or in enough depth to know that they're getting a re-education instead of an education? Do you know that? And do you know the difference? From before kids know what the word even means, teachers are asking them about their identity. The purpose of this is not to resolve the confusion of young minds. The purpose is to create confusion in young minds. The purpose is to turn your child into a political being. Remember about 20 years ago, a kid would return home from college with purple hair and a word they learned from last night's reading, and they would ruin Thanksgiving for everybody. That's actually leagues better than what we have right now. Now there is no last night's reading because reading is too dangerous. Reading could spark curiosity. Curiosity leads to questions. And questions lead to answers that are sometimes uncomfortable. Answers that sometimes take us outside of the parameters created by political correctness. Question or answers that are along the lines of, no, men can't get pregnant. And no, we shouldn't call a biological male a she. You start asking questions and you don't know where things will go. Now there is no last night's reading. There's only talking points. If today's talking points conflict with yesterday's, refer to today's. And if today's conflict with tomorrow's points, use tomorrow's. And on it goes. And so a generation that was raised to view anything racist or sexist with grave fear is now afraid of having those words turned on itself. They don't wrestle with complicated stories. They do not search for truth. They say what they are told when they are told. Is this the college education you wanted for your kid? Are you getting your money's worth? Is your kid really making the kinds of connections that last a lifetime? And what kind of life will it be if your kid just gloms on to each passing cause? As I mentioned, you might have one kid who 12 years ago did Occupy Wall Street, another who did Black Lives Matter, and if you had a kid who was in college more recently, they might have worn pussy hats and then done Black Lives Matter Part 2. I know you would love to think that your kid is living in a tent city right now because of the love in their heart. Their heart's just too big for this world. They just can't ignore the pain of others. And so that's why they glom from cause to cause, because their heart's too big. I would suggest that's not the case. I know that's not your kid. You know that's not your kid. So what is your kid doing exactly? What happened to their dream? And what will become of their future? You sent your kid to college, and instead they joined the revolution. How's that working out? I'm not going to tell you that the kids are all wrong. Most people actually do want to have a future and actually do use college for the purpose intended. But I can't see tent cities on the Diag and other schools around the country and tell you that the kids are all right either. Parents, your work didn't end at age 18. If your kid was on the pole, you'd pull them off. Do you have the guts now to pull them out of their tent city? Or have you joined the revolution too?